Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Center for Human Rights weekly COVID-19 discussion forum. This is the 10th edition, and our topic today is looking at how civil society can reposition for more impact during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Thank you for joining us today. And before we start, however, could you please kindly respond to a poll that will pop up shortly on your screen on your expectations from today's session? Please choose an option and submit this, and then we will continue. So by way of introduction, I think we could remind all of us that the International Bill of Rights recognizes and protects the freedoms of association, assembly, and expression of all people everywhere. These protections are reiterated in other global human rights treaties and declarations, as well as, for example, in the African Regional Human Rights System, where these rights are protected under the African Charter, as well as other regional treaties in Africa. And so the right to assemble, the right to organize, and to express ourselves freely are critical to a functional civil society and requires the support of a proper legal environment. As a special rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association noted, these rights to assemble and to organize are essential components of democracy. They empower men and women to express their political opinions, engage in literary and artistic pursuits, as well as other cultural, economic, and social activities, and to engage in religious observance or other beliefs, to form and join trade unions and cooperatives, and to elect leaders to represent their interests and hold them accountable. This idea expressed in the words of the Special Rapporteur are also re-echoed by the United Nations General Assembly, which has recognized that individuals, non-governmental organizations, and all relevant institutions have an important role to play in contributing to making the public more aware of questions relating to all human rights and fundamental freedoms through activities such as education, training, and research. And so in the Millennium Declaration, the UNGA resolved that we should give greater opportunities to non-governmental organizations and to civil society in general. So the importance of civil society imposes an obligation on states not to unduly interfere with the rights to assembly and to association. These protections of civil society extend to unregistered associations, registered associations, as well as the idea that even when we register, it should not be onerous, it should be simple, and it should not be something that would inadvertently exclude people from the protections of civil society. In essence, the role of civil society as an integral part of our democracy and human rights is very well established. However, what we want to do today is to engage in a deep dive on how these roles can be repositioned to have more impact in a world that is currently ravaged by a pandemic. So joining us for these discussions today, we have three people. First, we have Adebayo Okeowo, who is the program manager of Africa for Witness. Witness is an organization that utilizes video and technology to protect and defend human rights. And Adebayo will speak on the topic civil society in the digital age, how to maximize digital technologies as human rights tools in Africa. We will also be joined by Mulisa, the Executive Director for Great Lakes Initiative for Human Rights and Development, a Rwandan-based human rights NGO, and they'll be speaking to us on the topic, the role of civil society in closed societies during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Finally, we'll also be joined by Ismene Nicole, who is a senior technical advisor for the American Bar Association, and they'll be speaking to us on how civil society can leverage partnerships during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to give us their presentation, after which we will take comments and questions from audience members. Meanwhile, please feel free to use the comment box for your comments or questions. And so we will begin with Adebayo. Thank you, Adebayo.
Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, wherever you might be in your corner of the world. My name is Adebayo, and like Ayo said, thank you, Ayo, for the introduction. I'm the Africa Program Manager at Witness, and Witness is an organization that leverages video and technology for the defense of human rights, and I'm glad at the opportunity to be able to share on this webinar. Thanks to the Center for Human Rights for organizing this platform as well. The fact that we're actually all together on this webinar, as against typically maybe gathered in a classroom or in an event hall, having this sort of talk or workshop is evidence of the fact that we're in changing times and things are not the way they used to be. 2020 seems to be that year nobody ever anticipated. So that leaves us with having to get creative and come up with ideas as civil society organizations for how to most effectively maximize our impact despite the pandemic that we are all having to deal with. And when I was thinking about what I would share and how I would pitch this, I thought to approach, so civil society organizations work across different areas, thematic fields and spectrums, but I decided to highlight a few specific examples of kind of things that would be impacted as a result of the COVID-19. And that would include the nature of protesting, how civil society organizations have not been able to do that, or how they can then navigate that space with the restrictions that are currently being imposed. And then there's the area of human rights, fact-finding and research. There's the issue of monitoring and investigations. There's the aspect of visual storytelling. There's trainings and workshops. And there's something that I would refer just on the side to is archiving. And after all of that, I will talk about some of the clawbacks and the challenges to some of these solutions, even as we try to pivot to a new method of engagement for society as large. I will start off with the example of protests. So protests have been significantly impeded in order to protect public health at a time like this, and it's for good reasons. And in the midst of all of that, some civil society organizations have actually still gone ahead to demand that the freedom of association and the freedom of assembly should still be respected and protected. The case in point would be Germany, where the courts, the highest court of Germany has actually confirmed that people do have a right to protest even during times such as a public emergency and this pandemic that we're faced with. And that was very significant. And of course, the court also did say that they must stay in line with the guidelines in terms of social distancing and wearing of face masks and things like that. But that is very significant because it means that in countries like that, the individuals can go out and protest and exercise their rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of association. In countries like the United States, we've also seen whether there's been a law to uphold that or not, people have significantly protested over the past month, sparked by the death of George Floyd. And even though it creates cause for concern that there's not a lot of social distancing in all of those protests, you just realize that sometimes people feel the frustration of having to get the attention of government and they feel compelled to resort to such forms of activism. However, if we, as civil society organizations, want to see more effectiveness as we are having to stay indoors or maintain social physical distancing, one of the very, very powerful ways to do effective protesting, for instance, would be to embark on tweet storms. So organizations that may have had some aversion to being part of social media platforms, this is the time to ensure they get into those spaces. Digital rallies have been organized on platforms, especially like Twitter, and courses have been advanced by people using hashtags that make them to trend, and then they seek justice for certain causes. Whether it be in the recent case in South Africa with the gender-based violence, the killing of Seho, which some of us might be familiar with, or some of the cases we have had also in countries like Nigeria, like Justice for Tina, you would realize that attention was brought more to these issues because individuals engaged in tweet storms, in viral hashtags that not just raised awareness around these issues, but also went further to do very significant contributions such as fundraising for the victims and the survivors and demanding justice. So in the case of Seho, the lady who was unfortunately stabbed and hung on a tree in South Africa like a couple of weeks ago, we know now that due to the outrage on social media, the perpetrator has been arrested and is now facing a criminal prosecution. And that underscores the significance of platforms such as Twitter and other social media platforms that can be very instrumental in organizing and mobilizing people around a certain cause. And a very good example again would be to engage in hybrid protest, what I would call a hybrid protest. And a hybrid protest would be, for instance, deploying some physical items and using advanced technology. So take, for instance, we can't physically gather, we have to maintain social distancing. There have been ideas that have been pitched around how people could collect physical items and place them in a very public square. For instance, maybe shoes or personal effects of people who are passionate about a cause. Putting those personal items in a physical space that would attract attention, and then maybe deploying a drone to capture that and live streaming that could be a very powerful way of passing the message of discontent to the government or to whatever other target audience that the people have in mind regarding a particular issue. So that kind of hybrid approach could also be something that we could look into as organizations. Of course, it has to involve the deployment of a drone, which not many organizations may have the capacity to do. But yet again, there's an entry level where we can all come around to understand that when we speak of drones, we're not looking at your high-tech military level drones, but some of these other drones can be compact enough to still achieve the goal and the aim as our different organizations can try to afford such means. I'll move on quickly to the area of human rights fact-finding and research. So typically what we'd see at times like this or prior to the COVID-19 era would be organizations embarking on field trips. I know that some of the students of the Center for Human Rights too typically would embark on field trips to different countries in Africa to gather some research around a particular area of concern. When I was studying at the Center for Human Rights back in 2014 for the master's program, I had gone to Swaziland to investigate the issue of the rape culture vis-a-vis the reed dance that seemed to clash with people saying women could not wear miniskirts, but then women could go topless because that was cultural. But at that time, of course, I had the opportunity to travel and to interview people, speak to them physically. And at times like this, I'm sure that is impossible or is restricted to a greater extent. So we're having to embark on some other strategic ways of carrying out our research, and not just desktop research, but fact-finding that will be reliable and can be depended upon by other people. One of the very significant ways that this can be carried out, which has been in existence for some years now, is what's called the open source investigations, which I also know that a team at the center is a part of, because it's an initiative that has been more popularized by the Digital Verification Corps of Amnesty International and other organizations like the Human Rights Center at University of California in Berkeley. And what this would entail is for CSOs to begin to develop their expertise and their knowledge on how to use open source information to carry out investigations. And this has been very, very instrumental, even when it comes to getting cases into courtrooms and seeking justice. It requires a bit of skill. However, this might be some of the things we might resort to in this era where travel is restricted and is limited. And with open source investigation, you would have to also rely on digital platforms and any other form of open source information that is publicly available. And you have to also embark on layers of verification to be sure that you can rely on the information that you have discovered. There's a whole lot of conversation that we could have about this, which could be a separate conversation on its own. However, I would rather just move on to my next point because I know I'm limited on time. I think the next point I'll make would be in relation to monitoring and investigations. So again, normally we would have been able to go around when we hear about cases of violations to be able to go investigate it by ourselves and carry out some additional interviews with the victims or the survivors. And at such times like the COVID-19 pandemic, we're all in, that is of greater limitations. So I know some organizations have, prior to even the COVID-19 era, been embarking on some sort of digital platform tools that can allow victims of human rights abuses to be able to report the violations that they've suffered. In South Africa, you have an app that's called Vimba. It was developed by a section of the Mail and Guardian in response to the surging cases of violence against women, gender-based violence. And in a country like Nigeria, you have apps such as Rape is a Crime. And both of these are targeted at addressing gender-based violence. And what they allow the victims or the survivors to do is to be able to trigger a report of a violation that they've just experienced. Good thing is the Vimba app is not internet-based because, as I will discuss in a few minutes, you will realize that within the context of Africa, the issue of the digital divide can also be a challenge that we have to look into when we're talking about these digital tools and digital solutions for a pandemic time such as this. And then the other example which I would give would be visual storytelling. At a time such as this, we have to leverage the power of visuals. We know that visual can help trigger investigations, can help push for accountability. That's a space within which Witness works significantly. In the past, we have been able to use video to seek justice in cases such as the Thomas Lubanga case at the International Criminal Court, and justice on behalf of the Androids community of Kenya. And that's something that many organizations have to start to do more of. And it's not to expect that we have to do Hollywood style kind of productions, but to just realize that the ability to visually tell the story of a violation is very, very powerful and can be very compelling. Given the example again of George Floyd, if you were to reflect on how that video triggered the global protest, if you might call it, or at least the significant protest in the United States at this moment, if you take out the element of the video evidence, you might realize that it may not have been as triggering as we have come to see it. So wherever we can and whenever we can, let us use the power of videos and photographs to tell the story of human rights violations that may be currently swirling around in our communities, and also doing that with respect and dignity to the victims and the survivors, because very authoritarian governments use these tools also to counter the protesters and to go against those that are demanding justice and retaliate against them by arresting them and victimizing them even further. Knowing that I'm short on time, I'll quickly jump into the clawbacks and the challenges, some of which I've already mentioned, but I will start first with the issue of oversaturation. While we are encouraging everybody to go online and get digital, we have to also be measured in how we do this, because if you think about it, there are so many webinars right now. This is one, and there's a limited bandwidth with which organizations or individuals can participate. You get torn in between so many spaces. And so being very measured and deliberate about how we create our interventions in this moment where there's so much oversaturation is very, very key. And we also must be very wary of the oversaturation that also leads to misinformation and how to counter that. Because no matter how much people are aware of government propaganda, Once there's oversaturation of any form of information, people might be finding it difficult to decipher between what is true and what is not. So as civil society organizations, we might have to also be very clued up in how to counter misinformation and tell our truth through different methods. Second is to consider the issue of state surveillance, which is very rampant at this time. So a limitation to using digital platforms would be that we must be aware that we expose ourselves to greater risks of being surveilled, especially by authoritarian regimes. And that is something that may be a trade-off, but if you think that it will be of significant risk to your life in engaging on digital online activism, you might want to take a step back and reconsider how much of an involvement you want to have in that space, because then it's better you stay safe than for you to jeopardize your life and not be able to carry out the course that you have set out to do. And then when it comes to the digital divide, that is a very significant issue on the African continent and in other parts of the world, really. And one of the things we have been proposing for people to consider doing is to combine digital advocacy with still using traditional tools such as radio media, and such as newspapers. It's inevitable because in as much as we know we want to move everything online, we also realize that the digital divide makes it impossible for some members of society to still be connected at this time. And I'll give you a quick example as I wrap up. I don't know how many of us remember the case of Je suis Charlie, which happened in France some years ago. It was when a newspaper outlet that was always publishing satirical news was attacked by some terrorists. And the world went up in flames that how could this have happened? And people protested and were very upset at that sort of injustice. And people marched on the streets, including presidents of different countries, marched in solidarity. But at the same time that was happening, you also were witnessing another instance of a massacre in Baga community in northern Nigeria. And that never made the headlines because compared to Paris, that was a much more remote community that lacked access to cell phones or smartphones that would be able to take photographs and disseminate what was happening in their community. And it took about a week that massacre occurred, while at the same time Paris was happening. But it was after it had happened in Baga that it came to the knowledge of the international community, but there wasn't as much outrage as you had in the case of Paris, partly because of the digital divide. And we must ensure that while we're trying to bring everybody online and still reach out to our communities at this time, that we do not seclude or exclude other groups of people who might even need our attention and our focus much more. And the solution for some of these things would be to develop networks at the grassroots levels and to also infiltrate using traditional media. In as much as digital advocacy is very key, we can combine that with traditional media such as radio to ensure that nobody's excluded even as we proceed to embark on digital activism. I would stop here because I know my time is up, and I would welcome questions and further engagement later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adebayo. If you are just joining us, thank you for being here. This is the 10th edition of the Center for Human Rights COVID-19 Discussion Forum. And our topic today is how civil society can reposition for more impact during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. And we have just had a brief presentation by Adebayo Okeowo, the African Program Manager for Witness, who has just given us an interesting perspective on how civil society can undertake digital and hybrid engagements on human rights issues during this period, as well as giving us a reminder on the powerful effect of video technology and also the challenges we need to keep in mind in the use of technology during this period. So if you have any questions or comments, please write this in the chat window. I see that there are a couple of questions already, and we'll come back to it during the interactive session. Meanwhile, I will now hand over to Tom Mulisa, the Executive Director for Great Lakes Initiative for Human Rights and Development, a Rwanda-based human rights NGO, as he takes us on the role of civil society in closed societies during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Thank you very much, Tom. Over to you now.
Unmute. All right. Thank you very much for the previous presenter. I'm Tom Mulisa, the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Initiative for Human Rights Involvement. As the topic goes, the role of civil society, Rwanda was among the first countries to put in place the lockdown, and the topic was talked about the type of societies, and the lockdown in Rwanda was quite effective in that from 14th March, we had a lockdown, and up to recent where we have had a partial lockdown. But I think civil society played an important role during this period, because civil society organizations created WhatsApp groups within the civil society organizations, WhatsApp groups. That was quite important. We had a WhatsApp group for civil society organizations working around health to ensure that there's content supply, access to medicines, especially for persons living with HIV and AIDS. We had also a national network WhatsApp group for civil societies working around the key populations in Rwanda, which was created, one for the sexual minorities and another one for sex workers. So, and this brought together not only civil society organizations, but also community-based organizations and their leaders that were working with the particular groups. So civil society organizations, first of all, there was need to mobilize food, which was the most important thing at first, because most of the communities, the vulnerable communities, even the key populations, could not access their daily livelihoods. So civil society organizations created WhatsApp platforms, and they made contributions. Organizations made contributions and reached out to people to supply food, because that was the most emergent and eminent issue at first. Secondly, we had a problem because there were arrests during that time, and most people could not access, most people at the police and those in prison could not access court. So in collaboration with the institutions during this period, the Ministry of Justice put in place the court supplied video conferencing, and which is taking place even up to now in some of the areas. So for those people, through the support of civil society and collaboration with the Ministry of Justice, most of the people at the police stations and most of the people in prison could be heard through video conferencing. Of course, this worked in areas where you could find that there is enough internet connection. We should remember the fact that some of the rural areas, really the internet penetration is not all that perfect. And that was a problem also. And another thing that the civil society organizations did, including GLEAD, was seeking toll-free numbers, phone numbers. GLEAD has a toll-free number, and the most umbrella organizations also sought toll-free numbers, and most of the umbrella organizations and the consortium have toll-free numbers whereby community members could call for free without payment, so we could be able to intervene, especially where there could be arbitrary arrests. Then the lawyers could be able to intervene, because in those specific cases, lawyers were allowed to move through the bar association. Then our lawyers were allowed to move even when there was a lockdown to those particular areas, let's say police stations or prisons, or in case of arrests. So I think the toll-free method of availing a toll-free number assisted a lot. Also, civil society organizations worked close with the umbrella of religious organizations, but specifically in providing food again, because there was a large consortium divided up in the territory of the whole country for food provision, and which I think worked on. Another thing, we used Zoom, but when we talk about Zoom and digital meetings, this cannot apply in situations where people can afford internet. But our organization sought permission from the Ministry of Health and the local government, whereby when we had a partial lockdown, we were able to meet the representatives of the key populations around the capital city. We will not move outside the capital, but we were able to observe the rules, the health rules that we were given, and we were able to have a meeting with the key populations, the representatives of the key populations. I think using WhatsApp groups worked a lot, and the toll-free numbers worked a lot. Video conferencing for those detained at police stations and the courts also helped. But we are currently now doing a mapping, which began 2 weeks ago, which should be out within 2 weeks, which is a report, because right now the lockdown, we don't have, there has been partial easing of movements, except 3 districts, but for the other districts, people are respecting the health guidelines, and there's movement. So we are currently doing a mapping, visiting prisons to see those people in prison that were not able to attend court. We're also visiting police stations to see the number of people that were detained during the COVID period, to ascertain whether the police respected the time frame of detention without using COVID as an excuse. And we are also looking at the effect on the education sector also. We have also received a complaint from religious leaders, because churches up to now are not allowed to operate in regard to freedom of religion. And so we are right now trying to do a mapping of all these basic rights and see how much this lockdown had an impact on the basic rights of the people that the CSOs are serving here in Rwanda. I would stop here at this moment, and I would be very happy instead to welcome any questions in case they are. Thank you very much. Yeah. I would be happy to welcome any questions in case. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for sharing this enlightening narrative on the experiences of civil society advocacy in Rwanda during this period. I am particularly glad that WhatsApp is finding a more positive use for society than the spread of misinformation. Once again, for everyone in the audience, please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the chat window. This is the Center for Human Rights COVID-19 Discussion Forum, and we are looking at the topic, how civil society can reposition for more impact during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Before we go into the interactive session, our final presenter is supposed to be Ismene Nicole, the Senior Technical Advisor of the American Bar Association, but I'm not quite sure if she has been able to join us yet. It's either very early in the morning or midnight in America right now, so I'm not so sure if she's been able to join us. Ismene, are you online?
Ayo, we haven't seen her yet.
Okay. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, great. So since Ismene is not available right now, I think we'll just try and take some questions from the audience, and then if you are interested in speaking, please indicate by showing a hand and let us know, and then I will call on you and unmute you so you can contribute. Meanwhile, we have questions here for Bayo on the issue, on the app that he recommended. Bayo, do you want to respond to these questions? What is the name of the application to protect women against violence in South Africa? And could you elaborate on how the application works? How far has it been successful since its launch? And especially since you say it is not internet-based.
Sure. So good question, actually. Like I was mentioning earlier, that the Rape is a Crime app, for instance, which was developed by an organization in Nigeria called Global Rights, is internet-based, so you have to have internet access to be able to use that. They also have a mobile version of that app, so you could download it on Android for Android devices. However, the Vimba app, which was developed by a section of Mail and Guardian, I think is the Becky Center, it works on USSD, which means that you text a code. So you don't even have to download an app, actually. You have to text a code, and then it gives you a response and triggers a series of questions, like determining what the situation you are in, what help you need at that time, if you need some emergency support, if you need to contact the police, if you need some member of their team to call you and stuff like that. So it triggers a series of questions, and then it concludes with some helpful tips or somebody calling you to be able to determine further how they can be of support to you. To answer the question regarding how much impact it has had, that is not something I can verify because that was not with an organization I worked for. But I'm sure if you reach out to maybe the Mail and Guardian, you can find out more information about how it's been impactful. But I know that they did launch it specifically for people in the rural areas in South Africa who would typically not be able to have maybe enough access to internet services, or will not even have capable phones of downloading apps and stuff like that. So that's my response to that. And I think that that's a way to go for many organizations. While we create the solutions for mobile apps, we must make sure we put into consideration that some of the recipients or the users may not be that connected to the internet. And Kenya is a very good example. Now, this is not human rights related, but when you think of Kenya and how it is very well used, the M-Pesa, which is a mobile transaction form of payment, it's very ingenious and something that could be replicated and copied even for the human rights work of most NGOs, because anybody that has a cell phone in Kenya doesn't need an app, can just use their M-Pesa to transact, and many more people are getting into that space and being able to get their goods sold and receive money without the hassles and difficulties of banking transactions.
Thank you, Bayo. I'm not sure, did you mention the name of the app again? I think somebody...
It's called Vimba, V-I-M-B-A. It's called the Vimba app.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yes,
others were wondering if you could share some kind of links on resources and tools that could be used during this period.
Resources to be used. So in terms of, I would encourage you that in terms of resources relating to countering misinformation, there are a number of organizations that do a lot of work around this, including Witness. So Witness actually partnered with the Center for Human Rights last year in November to organize a workshop around deepfakes and shallow fakes. And deepfakes are, of course, very high level form of manipulation that is done to videos and to audios that make you believe somebody said something that they actually never did say. And you've seen this being used for nefarious purposes and used as an attack tool against women, especially where women's faces are being used and doctored to be placed over somebody in a pornographic film and stuff like that. And those kinds of women feel attacked. It's resulted to a lot of violence against them as well, especially online. So we have done a lot of work around how to spot that and how to counter that. And I would just encourage you to go on our website, www.witness.org. And if you also want to find the report from that workshop that we did, I'm sure the Center for Human Rights will gladly share that with the members of this webinar. But again, you could just search for that report on the center's website or on Witness's website around Deepfakes workshop in South Africa last year. So other organizations you can look into for assistance on resources on how to counter misinformation or how to spot false news will be Amnesty International's Digital Verification Core. I would strongly encourage that as many of you as have access, because I know some of the people on this call are also current students of the master's program, could reach out to Michael Inyako, who is the head of the litigation unit of the center. There is a team working on digital verification at the center. But for those who are not part of the center, you could definitely just check on the website of Amnesty International and search for the Digital Verification Project. And you would find more about how to counter misinformation or spot false items that are being circulated on social media. It's quite a very surgical process. But nonetheless, I think it's something we want to encourage more people to do to stem the spread of false news and misinformation that can be very harmful to society.
Thank you, Adebayo. I understand now that Nicole is online. That would be, I think, Tion.
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
sorry.
So yes, Nicole, like I mentioned earlier, is the Senior Technical Advisor for the American Bar Association, and she'll be speaking with us on how civil society can leverage partnerships during the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. Over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me well then? Yes, okay. Thank you so much. Apologies for being late. I think just mixing up a little bit on the time difference. It's quite early here. Yeah, good afternoon and good morning and good evening to the others. So yeah, just a few comments. I'm sorry I missed the remarks by my colleagues who came earlier. So I'll just see myself as sort of adding on and complementing what was already shared by my colleagues. I'm speaking about this issue of partnerships really from the perspective of where I am working now, which is outside the region, but working on the region. And in fact, you know, partnerships is key to what we do. So at the Rule of Law Initiative, we're working with a number of partners in countries all across the region in Africa. And so both with local partners and regional partners. So yeah, so my comments will be informed pretty much from the position that I have now. And I can just say that the role of partnerships is very crucial to our work even before the COVID pandemic hit. It's even more important now with all the different implications of that this has had on the continent, both just at a general level, but even more specifically with the civil society. So, I mean, we know that COVID has had a devastating impact on all spheres of life in the region, and I won't spend too much time on that. That there's been a number of discussions that have been focused just on that. But, you know, to emphasize that, you know, the livelihoods, especially with ESC rights and civil political rights, basically all spheres of our lives have been affected, and in particular vulnerable persons, which makes the work of civil society even more important and necessary at this time. So what we've seen, interestingly, is that the need for CSO engagement has been increased considerably during this pandemic. But at the same time, the mobility or the accessibility and the to do their work has been limited. So that creates quite a challenge. You have a situation where CSOs in the region all have been affected in one way or another in terms of programming, being able to implement their activities the way they would have intended. Specifically, examples, human rights monitoring and reporting, access to justice. Those activities have been quite limited, especially in the context of lockdowns and states of emergency. And then of course the risks also to human rights defenders has increased in terms of trying to maintain their activities and their work on the ground. Civic space issues is something that's ongoing. It was predated this pandemic, but it's a dynamic that we have to be able to respond to. So I think two areas that of attention is the civic space issue, the fact that there's reduced civic space in many countries across the region, and what impact that has on civil society at this point in time. For example, something that we've been working on just this now recently is a new law that's been adopted in Tanzania that has an effect of basically abolishing the public interest litigation suits. And we're working very closely with our partners to try to address that in terms of advocacy and litigation. Both, sort of at the national level and the regional and international level. So these are things that are ongoing. They're not, they're not stopping, though the pandemic is still on. And so these create new challenges and a new environment for CSOs to operate in. I think the electoral processes that are happening around the region now also are another dynamic that we have to see how to address and operate in. They demand a lot of CSO involvement in terms of monitoring and mobilization of the public and awareness. But again, I think the limitations are also there in terms of the states of emergency, the ability, the mobility issue. So this is just to emphasize really the need for partnerships at this time, strategic partnerships between national, regional, and international organizations. So I mean, any type of partnership and coalitions working in a network with networks, and specifically on advocacy, I would say is very important. Advocacy at the national and regional levels. Access to the African Commission, for example, is a very good example of how the partnerships over time have been extremely effective between national, regional, and international organizations. In my current role, we're working in East Africa, supporting partners in Uganda and Tanzania on freedom of expression. So we're supporting them in terms of their advocacy and litigation in this area. And we have a Southern Africa project as well, in which we're working together with our partners on various submissions to the AU and UN bodies that have to do with human rights defenders, the situation of women and women's rights as SGBV, highlighting various different issues. So these are just some examples of how strategic partnerships can have serious impact on meeting our objectives. I think that during COVID in particular, there's some challenges, but also opportunities. I think the main challenge is overall the economic situation in the world has had a serious hit. And so we have economies that are really suffering and that will suffer over the next coming months. And also the state's attention will be diverted from human rights to addressing the pandemic. So we as CSOs have to, sort of come together and really be more, have more solidarity in terms of how we want to achieve our goals and working together towards those. We have the closing of the civic spaces, as was also mentioned. Donor funding will likely be affected through all of this. And so again, we have to be more creative and innovative. I think in terms of opportunities, I would say that from what we've seen, at least from where I'm sitting, the donors recognize the challenges, this particular period in which CSOs are extremely important, but at the same time limited in how much they can do. And we have seen new streams of funding available just to address this issue. In other words, to support CSO work during this COVID pandemic. There's been a lot of new sort of funding that has been available just to support CSOs during this period. So having a number of rapid response kind of projects that are popping up in different areas, which I think is very, it's very timely, and it shows that there's an acknowledgement. There's also been a greater understanding by the donors in terms of CSOs meeting their targets during a time where they have been unable to operate in the normal circumstances. And yeah, I mean, I have examples of those. But I think the opportunity here is really the creativity and the innovation that this forces us to look forward to develop. A time for us to rethink and reprogram how we do things, how we engage, and to be innovative. I think that what has helped us most during this pandemic has been, sort of the internet, social media, being able to connect across borders, even without having to travel. I think there's, in some ways, while we thought that CSO activity would be halted by current circumstances, from what I've seen, I feel as if the CSOs have been even more active during this period. They've had more work to do. There's more issues, violations, restrictions that need to be addressed. And because of the restrictions, we've had to be innovative, and the internet has become a daily, sort of our dependence, and really has enabled us to do a lot of things that we hadn't thought of before, in terms of advocacy, in terms of engagement, leveraging the partnerships as was mentioned. So we, for example, are in daily contact with partners across the region, discussing developments that are happening, how we're responding to them, reprogramming, reformulating our interventions so that we can stay relevant and be responsive to the current needs. I would say those are my main points, and I don't know how we are on time, but I figured if there's questions and a discussion, then we can address any other points during that time. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for this informative presentation. As we all know, COVID-19 has severely impacted the physical realization of the rights of association and assembly. And this has affected even partnerships in the way, for example, which we meet, have conferences, seminars, and the other ways in which civil society has collaborated. Nevertheless, as Nicole has said, there are also new and innovative ways of engaging and partnering with one another that have become viable and relevant during this pandemic period. And so it will be to all our benefit if you can seek out and engages new opportunities. We have less than 30 minutes on the clock, and so we will just use the next 20 minutes or so to have an interactive engagement. Again, I would look at some of the questions first and take other comments that others may have or want to contribute to the discussion. So for instance, we have a comment here from, okay, let me just take a look at it. Hamed says, I find that civil society can play an important role in monitoring, in the mobilization of funds for vulnerable populations, in the protection of private data for people tested positive or placed under health observation. My question is how to support civil society organizations to fully fulfill this role. I think that's any one of our presenters who wants to take that. Either Adebayo or Tom or Nicole, please feel free. So how can civil societies themselves be supported by the wider society in the course of this period? Adebayo, would you like to go?
Okay, sure. So I know that one of the very effective ways that people have raised support for civil society at this time, again, has been through mobilizing and fundraising via social media, particularly around a certain cause. And it is a time when civil society organizations themselves have to show the work that they're doing. Like Nicole just mentioned, the donor field is very understanding at this time because of the restrictions. So donor agencies are also given some leeway in terms of deadlines for civil society organizations and stuff like that, and introducing special fund reliefs for some organizations working around issues relating to COVID. And if we look at it, every human rights organization would have something that has been impacted by this COVID-19 pandemic. So it's useful at this time to think of how can you pivot your work to acknowledge that and to reflect some of the challenges, because until people see how you're intervening in those spaces, there won't be possibility for you to get the necessary support. So those who are working around the area of gender-based violence have gotten a lot of support to keep fighting for the victims and the survivors. Those working around issues of racial justice and social equality are getting a lot of funding support from different organizations as well. And if you think of education, if you think of entertainment, if you think of tourism, think of migration, refugee, everything, prison reform, every sector has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would say as an organization, first, align yourself and make your work visible. And that way you can fundraise through public means, through social media, not just relying and depending on donor agencies, even though donor agencies themselves are also creating a pool of funding right now to address those working on COVID-19 related issues.
Thank you, Adebayo. Tom, would you like to contribute to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. I think this COVID period was a test for most of our CSO organizations on how much innovative we could be, because there was a traditional approach of responding to issues, but then we were caught up in the need to have some innovative approaches, most especially if such lockdowns and emergent situations are to go forward. I think that civil society has to shift. There should be a mind shift, and shifting even the modus operandi, how to implement their actions, and think about because I've seen we've had meetings with the donor communities here in Rwanda, and the questions have been, how do you respond to issues of teenage pregnancies within this period of time without reaching the rural areas? How do you respond to issues of human rights violations, those that have been incarcerated? How do you respond to the issues of persons living with HIV and AIDS who live a far distant from the health centers and who need to get medicine? Is there a possibility of availing the medicine? So I think that for the donor community and the partners, the civil society it's the high time now that civil society need to work together more close than ever, because if one organization is doing something, then one organization should be supplementing on what the other organization is doing. There's need close partnership for civil society organizations in terms of coverage, especially where one organization is operating, another one is not. That's one. Another thing is also being innovative and adjusting to doing things differently within this COVID context period that we are working in right now. Yeah, thank you.
Society could be supported also in other ways during this period. Do you also think you'll be able to shed some contributions or give some light, shed some light on that?
Is this for me? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
So the question which Bayo and Tom have been
okay.
engaging it, whether
no, I mean, I don't think I have a lot to add on that. I would agree with both with the comments. I think it kind of just depends on the situation. I think that having that in mind is always good, to think about. It doesn't necessarily need to be just you as an organization, but when you when you feel that it's where you need to bring in other partners, you can always have, I think, more of an impact. I do think that with advocacy, it becomes extremely important because we're in a situation where there's a number of governments that are particularly, difficult in terms of sort of human rights protection, where we're seeing new laws being adopted, for example, that restrictive laws that are threatening, sort of human rights defenders and civil society actors. And those in particular, I think, would need really the sort of a concerted response, not just within the country, but within the region and even beyond, as I said. In this recent situation that's happened now in Tanzania, the national actors have developed a strategy on how they're going to respond, both with litigation and advocacy. But we're also supporting them in terms of reaching out to the UN and AU bodies, the special procedures, to alert them to what's happening. So I think there's always something that can be done in terms of joining together and building upon the different sort of expertise and sort of scope of work of each member.
Thank you for that. So there's a question here about how, and I think Tom has touched on this a bit, but on how people who are in rural areas and who do not have the opportunities to access these technological facilities now, from Zoom to video calls and other kinds of technological tools that we are all relying on so much these days. Are they inadvertently being excluded in some way? Or is there a way that they could also be connected with and their issues could also be engaged during this period? The specific questionnaire asked it in terms of education, but I'd like to broaden it to other aspects as well, including even things like social services and healthcare. And, for example, I think Tom said you could send a text message to a WhatsApp group, but what of those who don't even have WhatsApp in this context? Are we going to inadvertently leave these people behind? So Tom, would you like to go on this?
Yes. Thank you very much. We got the same challenge because I can at least tell you that right now, at least in Rwanda, for the LGBTQ community, we have a WhatsApp group. Of course, not everyone has a WhatsApp phone, but at least we have. The country, I think, being small also becomes also somehow advantageous, at least for all corners of the country. We managed to have groups that are based in the community, the same sex workers and persons living with HIV and AIDS. But we got a challenge of penetration within the rural areas, whereby you find that you are not able to get a WhatsApp group, or you find few of them have WhatsApp groups and not everyone. So what we managed to do, because I think that's why I think that this was the best period for civil society organizations to come together, because in areas where we could not reach, we managed to sample and map civil societies that operate within that particular community that stay there. And this was the best period for us to see how each civil society is able to fill in the gap of the other. Because we had community-based organizations that are providing medicine to within those particular communities. And then we created contact with those particular communities. If it's those that are working on education, it's those that are working on health, and we created one platform at the national level. So it was been quite, it became quite simple that even areas where some organizations do not reach, there's one or two organizations that is operating at that community level. And I think the difference is that at least there are those that are providing food on a daily basis. There are those that are providing medicine, because we have organizations in every part of the country that are doing that. What we managed to do is bringing all organizations together and finding out who is working with the disability groups, who is working on health. So we have WhatsApp groups at the country level. We have one on human rights and criminal justice. We have one on health. We have one on education. We have one particular for sex workers. So we have seen the power of networking at this particular time, that in every part of the community, there is one or two organizations that are community-based that live there, that may be able to identify the issues at that community level in situations where one is not allowed to go there. The main challenge we're having right now, as I said, we are carrying out a mapping. It has been going on for 1.5 months. It should be done within 1 week or two, because as someone said, it has been pointed out that people can, for education, that students or pupils could follow on radio and TV. We have no data exactly on how many people have radios. We are not very sure. Of course, there are radio programs, education programs are taking place on radio and TV, but in those rural areas, how can we teach? For those that have been teaching, sometimes teaching may need physical, not the Zoom method for primary and pre-primary. So we think that after these 2 weeks, which I would be very happy to share the team at the center, and this would be shared to all of you, the mapping is going to be identifying how many people are able to access education through TV and radio. That is one. Two, how many people are able to access medicine even when the hospitals are quite distant. So we think that for us, this coming report that we are going to share with the center would inform the CSO's actions here in Rwanda, and this would bring us also to an engagement with the government on how innovative this could be done, because we should think through and see how can this be done, not providing a radio or a TV to everyone. I've heard some countries that TVs, radios are going to be provided. So I think that after this report, we are going to have a way forward for fuller engagement. Perhaps you can do the same or you could also find out how effective such mechanisms are in the particular communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So yes, clearly we all have a lot to do, and for the benefit of those who are watching us by YouTube or live stream, there are some comments here which are interesting. So for example, someone notes that civil societies need to collaborate and support each other during this period, and somebody says civil society should think about, generating their own funds and not over-relying on external donors. We have a comment on, that in Zimbabwe, there are protesters being arrested during this time. We need states to respect freedom of peaceful assembly and association, which is quite important. And so again, also more than ever, it's a comment that says CSOs must realize the importance of collaboration. Events like this should be a wake-up call for CSOs to adopt new technologies, because evidently the world of work would not be the same anymore. And so those whose primary strategy has been face-to-face interaction might be heavily impacted, and there should be strategies for virtual interactions, and advocacy should be incorporated in virtual interactions and advocacy should be incorporated in CSO operations. There is something interesting here, which I think Bayo might want to take. Somebody wants to know the extent to which Witness has engaged in the use of video verification tools on these Black Lives Matter protests. And I suppose this is also something that affects all of us even at this time, especially in relation to the way in which the COVID-19 situation has impacted peaceful protests, and also highlights the importance of engaging these issues in the face of increasing police brutality.
All right, thanks, Aya. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so good question, actually. And it's very, very true that the protest around the Black Lives Matter has been right at the center of the work that Witness does. And if you do go on our YouTube channel, you see a ton of videos that we have released, or tips that we've also shared right now around how to protest safely and effectively at such a time like this, and also how to use video to further highlight the injustice that is being witnessed around the world. Witness was actually founded following the case of Rodney King. And for those who are not familiar, Rodney King was also a Black American man who was brutalized by police officers in 1991. And back in those days, there was no Twitter, no Facebook, but his video was regarded as one of the very first viral videos ever, because it was filmed by someone on the balcony of his home with a camcorder. And for the first time ever, it underscored, so he released it to the local news channels, and before you knew it, it went national, and it sparked a protest. Because then for the first time ever, all that the Black community had said that they were being brutalized was now being seen on video by everybody in the country. And so it's from that moment on that we've continued to work in this space of how much value video can bring to exposing injustice and pursuing accountability. And we have a ton of trainings we constantly are also doing at a time like this to encourage communities in different spaces to use video effectively and safely to expose any form of police brutality or any kind of injustice, because there are many things. It's not just about holding up a phone or a camera to record. If it must meet some certain evidentiary standards, there are some things to adhere to, or if you want to use it for advocacy purposes, there are some things to take into consideration. So I'll just say that go on the Witness platform and do read up, or check on Twitter at witness.org, witness.org, that's our Twitter handle, and you'll find some of our resources being shared via that means. We've also documented some of the atrocities that have happened during this COVID-19 pandemic in Africa, specifically focusing on Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, and we released a collection of such videos on YouTube, also identifying the injustice and calling for accountability from government. And these are the ways that which people can all, at this time, you may not be able to go out, but if you are around the community and you have your cell phone in your hands, be able to call for help and document some injustice and share it with other people that can amplify those voices at critical times such as this.
Thank you very much, Adebayo. And yes, we all have this responsibility of also being the the civil society in our respective spaces. So we are running a little bit out of time. And so while there are so many other interesting comments and questions here in the chat, I cannot go through everything also. At least let's just all keep some of the things we've understood and shared today in mind as we move on. I will now call on all our presenters to just give a little closing statement, just maybe a minute or so, a closing statement on the entire topics, if you have any other thing you would like to add. And meanwhile, for our participants and audience members, there is a second poll here, which is asking you for your feedback on this discussion so far. We would like if you could just complete it while our panel members make their closing statements. So Nicole, we would like to start with you. Just give us a short closing statement. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I have any, anything to add at this point. I mean, just to say thank you so much for the invitation and for this discussion. It's very interesting, and I think, yeah, I mean, just to emphasize, I think the importance of this discussion as we go forward. There's been, like you said, a lot of comments. There's a lot of different types of challenges that people are facing, and so just to highlight the fact that it will be even more important in these coming weeks, I mean months, really to try to build on these collaborations that we have, at different levels, and to be creative and innovative, as we said, because the traditional ways of working may not necessarily serve us at this point. So really just trying to take advantage of that opportunity now to rethink and re-strategize, and to work together as much as possible. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Very awesome. Tom, could you please just give us a short wrapping up statement?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think civil society organizations always encounter problems in closed societies, but then with the COVID pandemic, with public health policies overriding some basic human rights, civil society organizations, I think, need to come close, work together, and create and think about more innovative approaches to operate and deliver services. I think it's time for civil society to come together and really work together to deliver the services to the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and we appreciate your contributions today. Adebayo, would you also like to give us a closing statement?
Thank you, Ayo. Thank you to the Center for Human Rights for organizing this platform. I think it's very important. I think I'll just mention that once life is getting back to normal, we should use this opportunity to do more grassroots work as organizations, because we've seen now that when pandemics such as this do hit the world, it restricts our ability to be able to support some of the most vulnerable members of community. So when this is, I want to say, when it's all over, we should be able to do more grassroots mobilization and communication with those people in more cut-off spaces, so that we can also very validly and effectively represent them when things like this happen. And for those who are at the front line of seeking justice and trying to hold people accountable, if you can't do it now, I would say archiving is a very useful way to ensure your evidence is preserved for when you can take the right measures to bring it before a court or a tribunal and seek justice. Thank you very much for all being here, to the center as well.
Thank you very much, Adebayo, and thank you all for contributing to today's COVID-19 discussion forum. It's been an enlightening session, and I really just want to urge everyone again, even though I don't need to do that since you're all here voluntarily, to just continue to keep these issues in mind, because again, human rights are very important, and we live in a world right now where they are at risk much more than ever before, and it is very possible for governments and state agents and even non-state actors to get away with violations, because it seems like there is less opportunity for monitoring and for observing what people do now But nevertheless, it's important for all of us who are interested in these issues, who form civil society and who try to be the, so to say, conscience of our respective societies, to ensure that civil society is not silenced and that people's rights continue to be protected and respected by the respective governments. This session is one of the several sessions that the Center for Human Rights holds. We hold 2 webinars every week on Tuesdays and on Thursdays. Please feel free to go to our website, www.chr.up.ac.za, for further discussions and for further opportunities to join webinars and similar sessions. You can also go on our Facebook and Twitter pages for more information on other activities we do. I see that there are quite a lot of comments that are asking around issues for the Center for Human Rights, but we cannot deal with them right now on this session. But nevertheless, whatever questions you have, feel free to write us an email or to interact with us on Twitter and the other ways in which we engage publicly. Thank you very much for coming, and this will be the end of today's session. So just feel free to log out at any time, and hopefully we'll see you